My name is Mandara. I've always loved reading real-life, scary stories. They fascinated me, but I never thought anything like that could happen to me. That changed a few years ago when I was 19. Something happened that changed that. It was New Year's Eve, and I was heading home after watching the fireworks. By the time I got back to my quiet, safe neighborhood in Sydney, Australia, it was 3 a.m. My friends wanted to call a taxi because it was so late, and we didn't want to wake our parents to drive us home. But I was stubborn and insisted we walk instead. It was a long walk, and while my friend Aidan complained the whole way, Benjamin stayed quiet and just went along with it. I was in a good mood, even laughing a bit as we got closer to my street. Eventually, we split up. The guys kept walking their much longer road home, and I went my own way. As I passed a small cake shop, I noticed a guy on the other side of the street. I only glanced at him for a second, but the way he quickly looked up at me like he was interested caught my attention. I continued walking quickly because I'm usually paranoid about things, but most of the time it's just my imagination. I turned onto my street, which was much darker than I expected. As I walked past the bowling club and the oval, I glanced behind me a few times to check my surroundings. It was cold and dark, and I started to feel nervous, but there was no one there. I was halfway down my street where the road goes downhill when I noticed something on the path ahead of me. I couldn't tell what it was, but at the last second, I stepped off the path and onto the road to avoid it. As I stepped onto the road, I turned slightly and saw someone behind me. They weren't too close, but not too far away either. My heart started racing because I hadn't noticed them before, and for them to get that close so quickly felt off. When I told people about it later, they said I should have been suspicious. I mean, it was 3 a.m., and someone was quietly walking behind me without keeping a safe distance. I couldn't see who it was, or tell if it was a man or a woman. It just looked like a black shadow. I only saw them for a second. Feeling scared, I quickly took out my phone and tried to call Aidan, but my phone wouldn't let the call go through. I tried calling Benjamin, but he didn't pick up. I called him at least 5 times, feeling more and more nervous, but I didn't dare look behind me to see if the person was still there. By the time I reached my driveway, I thought I was safe and hurried up it. Halfway up, I glanced over my shoulder and saw the figure again. The next part is hard to explain. It's all mixed up in my head. On one hand, it looked like they were just walking past my driveway, but on the other hand, it seemed like they were about to step onto it. At that moment, I thought maybe it was my brother Jonathan. I mean, who else would bother walking up my driveway? Even if someone was following me, I never thought they would actually go as far as walking into my yard. But something about the shape of this person didn't look like Jonathan, so I hurried inside. My mom had stayed up to wait for me, and I'm so glad she did because she opened the door as soon as I knocked. I don't even want to think about what could have happened if I had to wait outside. I went in, but left the second door open and the outside light on, thinking Jonathan might come in any minute. But when I mentioned it to my mom, she said, "You can turn them off. Your brother came home 2 hours ago." I felt a bit scared, but brushed it off. After all, we always think we're completely safe at home. I closed the door, turned off the light, and went to get a glass of water. Mom went to bed, and I went to my room to grab my clothes for a shower. While I was showering, I started thinking about the figure. I wasn't sure if it had been following me, but my mind kept going back and forth, wondering about it. Near the end of my shower, I heard a noise at the window. It wasn't the usual creaking or bumping noises you hear in an old house. It sounded like someone pressing their hands against the window to steady themselves. I immediately turned off the water and crouched under the window, hiding and waiting. I stayed like that for a while, too scared to move. Slowly, I crawled out, still too scared to stand up straight, and turned off the bathroom lights. But it was hard to dry off and get dressed in the dark. so I turned on the heater light, which is smaller and not very bright. That's when I noticed tiny blue lights at the window, lights that definitely shouldn't be there. The best way to describe it is that it looked like the keypad of a phone glowing. I felt so scared but turned off the heater light and backed into a corner, holding my towel tightly around me. I waited, too scared to unlock the door or move, knowing it would make noise. As I sat there in the dark, more blue lights appeared outside the window. They got brighter, and whoever it was seemed to be moving them, trying to shine the light through the glass. I finally unlocked the door and ran to my parents' room, shaking and trying to explain what was happening. My mom quickly found a safe room for me to change in while my dad went outside. He later said he heard footsteps running down the path. Knowing he heard it too made the whole thing feel more real. I couldn't sleep at all that night, and even in the morning I still felt scared. I learned my lesson. I'll never walk home alone at night again. Even now, I feel nervous walking during the day. It only takes one wrong moment to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and things can go very badly. Every year, my friends and I keep a tradition alive, something that goes back to my childhood when my dad and his buddies would go ice fishing on New Year's Eve. I grew up in a rural area of northwestern Ontario, far from the bustling cities and the chaos of large parties. My dad and his friends would load up their trucks with gear, fish rods, and thermoses of coffee, heading out to a quiet, frozen lake to usher in the new year in solitude. My mother wasn't around, and we didn't have much extended family, so my brother and I spent many New Year's Eves huddled together with the men, warming ourselves around a small campfire and fishing through the frigid night. After my dad passed away and my brother moved to Chicago, I still made an effort to keep the tradition alive. There's something about it that feels like an obligation, a way of honoring my roots, my father, and the memories of those cold winter nights spent in the middle of nowhere. This year, I wasn't alone in keeping the tradition going. My two best friends, Nate and Trevor, both rugged outdoorsmen who grew up in the same small town, were up for the trip. Nate, with his massive four-wheel drive truck and larger-than-life personality, was the one driving. We packed everything we needed: fishing rods, bait, a sled to haul our gear, and a small portable shelter to protect us from the bitter cold. As much as I knew we were prepared for a night of fishing, there was always a sense of unease when heading into the wild. You never really know what's going to happen in places that are so isolated. The lake we were heading to was one that had been in the family for years, a hidden gem tucked away far from any main roads. It wasn't a well-known fishing spot, and that's exactly what we liked about it. There was no traffic, no crowds, just the sound of the wind whistling through the trees and the occasional creak of the ice beneath us. It was an escape, a chance to disconnect from the world and just enjoy the simple peace of nature. I could already feel the excitement bubbling up as Nate navigated the snowy back roads, his tires crunching through the thick layer of snow. We laughed and joked along the way, the chill in the air adding to the thrill of the trip. As we neared the trailhead, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. There was a figure standing in the distance, just a few yards from where we had parked. He was bundled up in heavy winter gear, standing unnervingly still in the middle of the snow-covered landscape. At first, I thought maybe he was another angler, waiting for a group to arrive, but something about the way he was standing made me uneasy. He was just staring at our truck, his eyes hidden behind dark goggles and his body tense, unmoving. I watched him glance down at his phone, then look up at us again, and then back to his phone. The whole situation felt off. I muttered to Nate and Trevor that the guy was creeping me out, but they didn't seem as concerned. Trevor shrugged, dismissing it, and Nate just nodded, not saying anything. We began unloading our gear, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling gnawing at me when the man suddenly rushed toward us, his arms flailing wildly. I rolled down the truck window, unsure of what to expect. The man was frantic, his breath visible in the cold air. He started shouting, claiming that his friend had fallen through the ice and was in immediate danger. His voice cracked with desperation as he told us that his friend had just texted him and was now trapped in the water, struggling to stay afloat. He pointed at his phone, his hand shaking, showing us a message that looked legitimate enough to us at the time. It was hard to ignore the urgency in his voice. I glanced at Nate and Trevor, both of them now looking more concerned. Despite my gut telling me something wasn't right, we all agreed that we couldn't just ignore him. What if his friend really was in trouble? We quickly grabbed what little we had, no coats, no additional gear, and followed him, leaving our shelter behind. The man was practically sprinting down the snow-covered trail toward the lake, and we had to jog to keep up. The further we went, the more my doubts grew. As we approached the lake, I realized we weren't heading toward our usual fishing spots, where the ice was thick and safe. Instead, the man led us toward a more remote part of the shoreline, an area that was further from where anyone would typically fish. It didn't make sense. I slowed my pace, ready to stop and ask what the hell was going on, but it was too late. In front of us, 2 more men suddenly appeared from the shadows of the trees. They weren't wearing fishing gear and weren't moving in a hurry. They were just standing there, waiting for us. I could see something in their hands. My blood ran cold. The men had guns. "Stop right there!" one of them barked, raising a handgun and aiming it directly at me. I froze. My heart dropped. I had no idea how to react. That moment felt like it lasted a lifetime. My mind raced, trying to process the situation, but my body was rooted to the spot, unable to move. The man we had followed turned around, a smirk creeping across his face. My gut twisted in a sickening realization. We had been set up. The second man stepped forward, and his voice was calm but cold. "Give us your keys, everything you've got now," he demanded. Nate didn't hesitate. His face went pale as he reached into his pocket and tossed the truck keys to the man with the gun. The rest of us followed suit, emptying our pockets of wallets, phones, and whatever else we had on us. I tried to hold on to my phone, but the man waved it away, telling me it was too late for that. Nate, quick on his feet, lied, saying his phone was still in the car. They laughed at this, but didn't question it further. They were taking what they wanted, and there was nothing we could do to stop them. My stomach churned with frustration, anger, and disbelief. The man with the gun motioned for us to follow him back up the path, and we complied, too afraid to argue. The other 2 men backed away into the woods, presumably to their own vehicle. We stood there for a moment, shivering in the cold as they disappeared from view. Nate's eyes were wild with fury, his hands clenched into fists, and I could hear him muttering curses under his breath. Trevor and I just stood there, stunned and freezing. I couldn't understand how we'd gotten into this mess. Who were these people? Why had they chosen us? As soon as they were out of sight, Nate pulled out his phone. Despite his earlier lie, I knew he had to have some sort of plan. He dialed the police, explaining the situation as best as he could. The dispatcher told us to stay put, and we huddled together, doing our best to keep warm as we waited for help to arrive. Every minute felt like an eternity. When the police arrived, they took an official report and did their best to comfort us, though it didn't feel like much. We were shaken, angry, and still processing what had just happened. It was surreal. The robbers were gone, and Nate's truck was nowhere to be found. The authorities promised to search the area, but we knew it was already too late. The truck had likely been driven far away by now. They drove us to Trevor's house, which was the closest, and after a long, silent ride, we arrived at his place, still trying to piece together the events. The three of us sat there for hours, unable to shake the feeling of having been watched, of having walked right into a trap. We tried to make sense of it all. Why would anyone be out there waiting for us in such a remote place on New Year's Eve of all days? It didn't add up. Trevor thought we had just stumbled across the wrong people at the wrong time. Maybe they weren't planning on robbing us specifically, but when they saw us, we were the perfect targets. I didn't know if I believed that. The whole thing felt so orchestrated, so deliberate. How could they have known we'd show up at that exact spot, at that exact time? Nate, still furious, couldn't let go of his anger. He kept kicking trees and swearing under his breath. I was just numb, unable to think straight. The whole ordeal left me questioning everything. We'd been so careful, so prepared, but somehow we'd walked right into the hands of criminals. Weeks later, the police were still no closer to finding Nate's truck or identifying the robbers. It felt like the entire thing had been swept under the rug. Another random act of violence in a place too quiet to matter. But for the three of us, it was an experience that would haunt us forever. The feeling of being watched, of having been in the wrong place at the wrong time, never quite left. Every year, when we go back to that lake, I can't shake the feeling that something, or someone, is still out there, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to fall into their trap. It was supposed to be a peaceful drive. New Year's Eve had always been a time for reflection, and I was looking forward to the quiet comfort of spending the evening with my parents in upstate Pennsylvania. The journey was supposed to be simple, just a few hours of driving, some time to think, and then a fresh start to the new year. But what should have been a calm night turned into a nightmare that still haunts me every year. I left in the late afternoon, hoping to beat the storm that was forecasted to roll in. But an hour into my drive, snow started falling. At first, it was just light flurries, nothing more than a dusting on the windshield. I thought it was beautiful, the kind of snow that feels magical in the moment. But I soon realized I had jinxed myself. The snow began to fall harder. Visibility dropped. The highway was slick, and the small sedan I was driving was struggling to maintain traction. The further I went, the worse the storm got, until I found myself in the middle of a full-blown blizzard. The tires were slipping on even the smallest hills, and it became clear that continuing was too dangerous. I pulled over to the shoulder of the road, hoping to wait it out. I sent a quick text to my parents, letting them know what had happened. They were worried sick, but I reassured them as best as I could, telling them that I was safe and just waiting for the storm to ease up. But as the minutes turned into hours, the storm only seemed to worsen. The snow piled up around my car, and I realized there was no way I'd make it to my parents' house that night. My dad offered to try and reach me, but I told him it was a death wish. If the snow didn't let up, I'd call the police for help. I didn't want to, but it was looking like the only option. For now, I decided to wait. I turned the engine on and off every so often, trying to conserve fuel and keep warm without killing the battery. The wind howled outside, and the isolation of being stranded on that empty road began to sink in. That's when I saw the headlights. They cut through the storm, growing brighter in the rearview mirror. A snowplow appeared, slowly coming to a stop beside my car. I felt a surge of relief. Finally, help had arrived. The driver was an older man, probably in his late 50s. He had a rough, weathered face, with deep wrinkles that made him look like someone who'd spent a lifetime braving harsh winters. He didn't immediately speak, but instead just stared at me. His gaze was unnerving. Eventually, he asked if I was okay, his voice gruff and rough like he'd been smoking for decades. I told him I didn't think my car could handle the storm and was grateful to see him. He nodded, telling me I wouldn't get far in this kind of weather, especially with the car I had. He offered to give me a ride, and at first I hesitated. He seemed kind enough, but something felt off. Still, I didn't want to spend the night in my car, so I reluctantly agreed. He said it would be no problem and that I should leave my car behind. Without thinking much more of it, I grabbed my bag and climbed into the cab of the snowplow. The warmth inside was a welcome relief from the biting cold outside, and I started to relax a little. As we drove, I gave him directions to my parents' house. But as time passed, I began to notice something strange. He wasn't driving in the right direction. We were on a local highway, and the GPS was clearly pointing the wrong way. My stomach sank as I realized we were heading in the opposite direction of where I needed to be. I asked him if we were going the right way, trying to sound casual. His response was unsettling. He said we were taking a short detour, that the back roads would be better than the highway. I didn't know the area well enough to argue, but something about his tone made my gut twist with unease. We continued down the back roads, but the further we went, the more uncomfortable I became. The GPS kept recalculating as he missed turns, not even bothering to look at it. That's when I noticed something that made my heart race. There were empty liquor bottles on the floor near his feet, crumpled maps shoved into the side pockets, and a knife wedged between the seats. My fear escalated as I realized we weren't just lost. We were heading farther and farther into nowhere. I started to panic. My mind raced with the worst possible outcomes. I kept telling myself to stay calm, but my pulse was pounding in my ears. Finally, I spotted a house in the distance, my chance to escape. As we got closer, I made a snap decision. I couldn't stay in that truck any longer. The best way to describe it is that it looked like the keypad of a phone glowing. I felt so scared, but turned off the heater light and backed into a corner, holding my towel tightly around me. I waited, too scared to unlock the door or move, knowing it would make noise. As I sat there in the dark, more blue lights appeared outside the window. They got brighter, and whoever it was seemed to be moving them, trying to shine the light through the glass. I finally unlocked the door and ran to my parents' room, shaking and trying to explain what was happening. My mom quickly found a safe room for me to change in while my dad went outside. He later said he heard footsteps running down the path. Knowing he heard it too made the whole thing feel more real. I couldn't sleep at all that night, and even in the morning I still felt scared. I learned my lesson. I'll never walk home alone at night again. Even now, I feel nervous walking during the day. It only takes one wrong moment to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and things can go very badly.